Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first External Partners webinar for the 2021 Spring Hydrologic Outlook. I am Katie Ertel, a hydrological meteorologist at the National Water Center. Today's briefing will be a general overview of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Greater Mississippi, Souris River, Red River of the North, and Great Lakes basins. Today's presenters are myself, Katie Ertel, and the Service Coordination Hydrologist or Senior Hydrologist from the 5 River Forecast Centers, Jim Knoll from the Ohio River Basin Forecast Center, Mike Welvert from the North Central River Forecast Center, Kevin Lau from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, James Paul from the Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center, and Jeff Grashel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. This webinar is being recorded and a follow-up email will be sent with information on how to access that recording. Should you have a question during the presentation, please go ahead and type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar GUI, and we will address all questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Let's start today by taking a look at the winter precipitation so far across the Mississippi Basin and how it compares to last year. Overall, a stark difference can be seen between this year in that center graphic there and last year in the graphic on the right. Below normal precipitation this year for the season has been observed across the majority of the greater Mississippi Basin. The one exception to that is a portion of the Central Plains, particularly in Kansas and Oklahoma, where you can see those green colors that I have circled there. That area is just above normal precipitation, so 150% of normal for this winter season. However, we will touch on this later, but the majority of that rainfall did occur earlier in the season, so in December. Taking a look at the last 2 weeks, which you can see in the graphic on the left, above normal precipitation in this time period was observed across the Central Plains and into the Midwest after several storm systems traversed that region, as indicated there by those blue shades, which I have circled in that graphic. We did also continue to see a dry pattern over the last 2 weeks, shown in the red there across the Northern Plains and Arklatex region. We move on to the next slide, now looking at temperatures, starting with the graphic on the left, looking at the last 2 weeks again, you can see the effects of that continued blast of cold Arctic air and the change to below normal temperatures across much of the basin. This cold blast continues to heighten the concern for ice developments in the Northern Plains and the upper Midwest, which the RFCs will cover later in the presentation. However, the seasonal temperatures remain above normal for now, as you can see in that middle graphic, which is not much of a difference from last year in the Mississippi River Basin, as you can see in that graphic on the right. The only exception to that is that currently temperatures are near normal across the lower Mississippi and Tennessee valleys, as indicated by that gray color in those regions in the middle graphic there. For the season so far, we are also still seeing abnormally warm conditions over the Northern Plains, but that may change over the next couple of weeks. Now looking at snowfall, moving on to this slide, if you take a look at the graphic on the left, displaying the snowfall percent of mean from the last 2 weeks, you can see that that Arctic air that I talked about on the previous slide also brought above average snowfall to the Central Plains and into the Midwest for that time period and caused the seasonal average, which you can see circled in that middle graphic there, to rise. Overall, though, in this middle graphic, most of the basin's above average snowfall is really just contained to the Central and Southern Plains this year. That swath of purple that you see across Texas and Louisiana is from a significant snowfall event that they had last month, which has since melted. Even more snow is forecast for this region early next week, so that area will likely continue to be highlighted, but snowfall there is expected to quickly melt again and not affect the overall long-range outlook for the spring. Elsewhere across the basin, the snowfall percent of mean is below normal. So compared to last year in that graphic on the right, we have seen much less snow in the Northern Plains so far, which could help to mitigate the flood potential in the spring. And we can see that also on this next slide here, looking at the water content across the region. The first thing you'll notice here is in that circled area, there is a lot less snow water content across the Great Lakes and into the Northern Plains compared to this time last year. So similar story in the Eastern Dakotas, where we are seeing very little snow content this year. The only difference I did want to point out, and our RFCs will touch on a little later, is that there is slightly higher amounts of snow water content this year in the northern portions of the Ohio River Basin. Now, taking a look at soil moisture across the basin, big change from last year. We're only seeing some isolated pockets of elevated soil moisture content, really in those same areas where we saw above average precipitation. So in Kansas and Oklahoma, but otherwise, much different story across the northern plains and the lower Mississippi Valley, which I have circled here, where the soils were very saturated last year and are now below normal this year. If we take a look at the USGS 7-day stream flows, most of the Mississippi Basin is experiencing normal to slightly above normal stream flow, which you can see in those green and blue shades on the map. A bit of a change from last year, which you can see in that graphic on the bottom right, where most stream flows in Mississippi Basin were much above normal. So you'll also notice those white sections in the upper Midwest and northern plains. That's typical for this time of year. That's where we are iced in, or where seasonal gauges are not taking measurements. But you do see some greens and blues surrounding that area. So that is indicating that where there is flow, it's currently normal to above normal. Here is the current U.S. drought monitor released this morning, showing that moderate to severe drought is present in the northern and central plains. A very different situation from last year at this time, which you can see in the lower left-hand corner on this slide. So really pulling all of this together, overall what we're seeing, especially across portions of the upper Missouri and Mississippi basins, are dry and antecedent conditions, which began last summer and has now continued through the winter season. It's important to note that those drier soils have the potential to reduce the amount of runoff from melting snowpack through the spring, and thus reducing the spring flood risk. This next slide is showing the amount of flood storage capacity that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has within the Mississippi Basin. So still plenty of room here flood storage wise, so no concerns at this time. Moving on now to this slide. Elevated water levels have been an ongoing issue in the Great Lakes, so we did want to highlight this. This information comes from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Detroit District. So this is based off of the February 6-month forecast, which forecasts for the months between February and July. So overall, Lake Ontario is the only lake that is back to near average water levels. All of the other lakes are expected to be below record highs, but still well above average. This is really important because flooding of inland streams and rivers will be much slower than normal to drain into these lakes, and future storm systems that come through this spring may cause erosion and lakeshore flooding. Switching gears a little bit to talk about temperature and precipitation forecasts and the climate outlooks that may influence our river outlooks this spring. The biggest story for this coming week for the Mississippi Basin will be a reinforcing Arctic blast, which is forecast to bring below freezing temperatures to even the southern plains this next week. So for the northern plains and for the upper Midwest, this is going to increase ice development across rivers, which we'll get into a little later in the presentation. Additional snowfall is also possible across the southern plains and through the Midwest. And then rainfall over the next 7 days will really be focused from the southern plains into the mid to lower Mississippi Valley, through portions of the Tennessee Valley and into the southeast, as you can see there. So 2 to 4 inches of rainfall is forecast through February 18th, and that's resultant of multiple systems and surges of moisture that are going to push through the U.S. over the next week. Now, if we move on to take a look at the Climate Prediction Center's Week 2 outlook, there is a high probability for normal temperature, or for below normal temperatures across the majority of the Mississippi Basin in Week 2. So you can see in that graphic on the left. So not much relief expected temperature-wise for you folks up north in Week 2. There's also a low probability for above normal precipitation in Week 2 across the eastern portion of the greater Mississippi Basin, and then less certainty in precipitation amounts as we move to the west and the north. Looking out further at the latest seasonal outlooks, which take us into spring and through April, as expected, probabilities favor above normal temperatures across the majority of the U.S. And then in the precipitation map here, as is common in a La Nina pattern, which is what we are in right now, probabilities also show that that above normal precipitation chance will gradually shift into the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, the upper Mississippi Valley, and the upper Missouri Valley. So this will be extremely important to watch, as the susceptibility to flooding in the greater Mississippi Basin is driven by those convective rainstorms, which are typical in the springtime. And finally, we're going to transition from our weather and climate outlooks into how this is all expected to impact the hydrologic outlooks for this spring. So on this slide, you can see that there is a low to medium risk of widespread significant flooding expected across the basin through the spring. Near normal to below normal flood risk is expected for much of the basin, except for portions of the Ohio River Valley where the flood risk is above normal. Ultimately, as we go through this season, the amount of snow available for melt, and then also the frequency, intensity, and extent of additional springtime rainfall will determine the final outcome of the flood risk for the spring. Now I'm going to pass it over to Jim Knoll from Ohio River Basin to discuss the potential for flooding in his region.
All right, thank you, Katie, and good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start off by taking a look at what has been going on in a little bit more detail in the Ohio River Basin if we move on to the next slide. And we're going to look at precipitation over the last 30 days. And the big news there is that we have turned quite a bit wetter in the southern half of the Ohio River Basin, with anywhere from 2 to 6 inches of precipitation. The hardest hit areas have been in Kentucky and into a little bit of West Virginia, along with southern Indiana and southern Illinois. Most of the southern 2/3 of our basin is now above normal precipitation in the last 30 days. So even though we have averaged close to normal, in some areas below normal since December 1st, that has really been changing in the last 30 days. The exception would be Middle Tennessee, that's still below normal, but again, even there, we expect the areas down there to see above normal precipitation in the coming weeks. I do want to highlight a couple of things. With the recent cold air outbreak that Katie talked about, we're seeing frost depths in the northern portion of our basin in the 2 to 6 inch range. That's important because that can lead to a more intense runoff as we switch into a warmer, wetter pattern. So that's something that we have to watch. We're also seeing ice forming on our northern basin rivers right now, but it's not too significant at this time. And the other big thing is the eastern half of our basin is now above normal snowfall for a typical, relative to a typical winter. And our snow water equivalents are building, especially in the northern and eastern areas of our basin. So this is something that we have to really monitor over the next few weeks, as it can change pretty quickly. Moving on to the next slide, let's go ahead and talk about the flood risk here in the Ohio Basin. This is really through the end of April, beginning of May, and we're expecting widespread minor flooding, at least a 50% or greater chance through a good portion of the Ohio River Basin. The exception would be the far upper Ohio Basin. But even there, we have to monitor because the snowpack is building currently in that eastern basin area, and we do have a couple more storm systems on the way next week that will build that snowpack further. And some moderate flooding is expected in the lower Ohio Basin this spring. Moving on to the next slide. It's also important because, unlike some parts of the Mississippi drainage system in the Ohio Valley and Cumberland Valley, snowpack is usually not the biggest contributor, and therefore it's all about the rainfall and the intensity of that rainfall. And so a lot of times we also look at probabilities below 50% as a real possibility of occurrence, and we need to respect that. And what you see here is the 25% chance or greater of occurrence of flooding from now through the end of April, beginning of May. And what you see is a lot more red dots, which is moderate flooding, and even some purple dots in Kentucky on back into southwest Indiana and southern Illinois. And that's representative of the potential for the possibility of major flooding. So we have a real flood risk this late winter into early spring across the Ohio River Basin. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to break it down a little bit by areas within the Ohio Valley. We'll start off in eastern Illinois and Indiana, where we are expecting pretty widespread minor flooding this late winter and early spring in the Maumee Basin in northeastern Indiana, as well as the Wabash Basin in Indiana and along the Illinois border, as well as the East Fork of the White and most of the White River basins and the Embarrass. Some moderate flooding is expected through the lower White Basin, the lower Wabash Basin, and the Little Wabash Basin in southwest Indiana and southeastern Illinois. Moving on to the next slide, we'll shift gears down into Kentucky and Tennessee, where we are expecting in the state of Kentucky minor flooding throughout a good portion of the state, including the Kentucky Basin, the Rough River Basin, the Green River Basin, the Upper Cumberland Basin, and Elkhorn Creek Basin. It should be noted, though, even though, again, we're talking about the 50% chance or greater of occurrence of minor flooding in the state of Kentucky, just below that, there is a 25 to 50% probability of moderate to major flooding in the Kentucky River Basin and a 25 to 50% chance of moderate flooding in the Green, Rough, and Upper Cumberland Basins, as well as Elkhorn Creek Basin. Moving along up to Ohio and West Virginia, we are expecting a decent chance of 50% or greater for flooding in the Maumee and Huron River Basins in northwest and north central Ohio, as well as some flooding along the Lake Erie shoreline that'll be dependent on storm systems due to the high water levels that Katie was talking about earlier. Further, we are expecting minor flooding in the Muskingum Basin and Killbuck Creek area of central and east central Ohio, the greater Miami River Basin in southwestern and west central Ohio. That does not include the flood protected levees around Dayton, Ohio, though. And we also expect some minor flooding in the Scioto River Basin in central and south central Ohio. And then over into northern West Virginia, we expect minor flooding along the West Fork and Tigert River Basins. It is important to note that we do expect some erosion and high water impact events along Lake Erie that'll be driven by a wind events as we go later into the winter and early springtime. And again, it should also be noted there's at least a 25% or greater probability of moderate flooding in the St. Joe River in northwestern Ohio, the Huron River in north central Ohio, the Scioto River in central Ohio, Killbuck Creek in central and east central Ohio, and then in West Virginia along the Cheat, West Fork, and Coal River Basins. I do want to highlight we have some very high water contents of snow in the Cheat River Basin in northeast West Virginia. That does need to be monitored as we go over the next 2 to 4 weeks. Now let's go ahead to the next slide and shifting gears. We're going to talk about the Ohio River itself. We are expecting minor flooding below Louisville this spring. And there's also at least a 25% chance of the possibility of minor flooding along a good portion of the Ohio River downstream of Pittsburgh. Moving on to the next slide, in the shorter range, our 10-day flood risk outlook, we are indicating with those storm systems that I was talking about earlier for next week. We're expecting snow and a mixed bag of precipitation from 2 storm systems, one early in the week and one a little bit later in the week. And depending on how the precipitation falls, we could begin to experience some minor flooding in portions of Kentucky and West Virginia. It just depends on how warm it gets. Moving on to the next slide, over the next 16 days, the rainfall forecast is with a series of storm systems with that wet signal for our basin. We expect 2 to 5 inches of precipitation. Again, it'll be a mixed bag of rain and snow. And depending on how it exactly falls will determine just the exact extent of any flooding over the next 2 weeks or so. But we are expecting the heaviest precipitation to occur from middle Tennessee through Kentucky and into West Virginia, with lighter amounts to the northwest, where the flood risk is delayed slightly as it's colder in those areas in northern Ohio, northern and central Indiana, back into east central Illinois. And so that flood risk is probably more likely delayed until March in those areas. Moving on to the next slide then, we'll kind of summarize it up here for the Ohio and Cumberland River Basin for our late winter and spring flood potential. We are expecting minor to moderate flooding across a good portion of the Ohio Valley this spring. Major flooding cannot be ruled out, especially in southern Illinois, southern Indiana, into Kentucky. The flood risk is considered above normal for the Ohio River Basin at this time, except still near normal in the upper Ohio Valley, but we need to monitor these snowstorms over the next few weeks to see how that snowpack develops in that area. The flood risk right now is considered above 2020, but below 2019 levels, to give you a frame of reference. And again, we are expecting some Lake Erie shoreline flooding into the spring, and the windstorms will be the primary factor when we get those north winds driving that higher water level up onto lowland agricultural areas and those kind of things. And finally, rainfall placement and timing and the extent of thunderstorms will determine the final outcome of our flood risk in the Ohio Valley. Almost all the time, significant flooding in the Ohio Valley is associated with convective thunderstorms. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike at the North Central River Forecast Center.
All right, thanks a lot, Jim. I'm going to tie into what Jim has said and what Katie has said today. I'm going to start out for our area in North Central River Forecast Center. Much of our service area has been very dry over the last several months. And as has been discussed already, there's an extensive area experiencing drought or at least abnormal dryness across at least the northern half of our area, either normal or even a little below normal throughout the rest of our basin as well. And that dryness, as we move into the next slide, has continued on into the winter months here. The below normal precipitation has continued across most of the area that we are responsible for. The one exception really has been from Iowa eastward across northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. Several storm systems have impacted this area, and as such, the most snow and the most snow water content from the snow is laying in this band. Of course, there's also a higher amount of snow across the Minnesota Arrowhead region and also in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. But even though that's high right now, that's actually below normal for those spots for this time of year. On the next slide, we'll look at the snow water content and how we rank that. This is compared to our historical record. The northern portions of our service area have had very little water on the landscape. And in fact, they're in the lowest 10% for any year in our records, denoted there by the reds and oranges. But the area that stands out for us is that band we just talked about, running from Iowa over to Illinois and southern Wisconsin. In those areas, the amount of snow water content is in the top 10% historically. So there's much more water in the area there than we have normally. In the next slide, we'll take a look at our overall flood risk across our service area. So not surprisingly, the dry conditions are borne out in our flood risk potential for this year. For much of our area, we're not anticipating much flooding to really occur. And where flooding does occur, or has a greater than 50% chance of occurring, it appears that the most likely outcome will only be in the minor flood category. Of the 475 forecast points that we have in our service area, only 95 are indicating a greater than 50% chance for any kind of flooding. And only a very small number of those have a greater than 50% chance of exceeding the moderate or major flood category. So our primary area of concern then, we'll zoom in on Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Wisconsin, and where that band of heavier snow and snow water is lying, that's where our primary concern is for this year. But even if we get flooding in this area, it does appear that the majority of it is going to be of the minor variety, and that's shown by the orange icons we have here. There are a few reds and a purple in there, suggesting that flooding could reach the moderate level or higher. But unless things really change, the flooding in this area does appear to mainly be of the minor variety at this time, unless we get more significant storm systems. And of course, we do have several more months of winter here, or not months, several more weeks of winter weather here. And then of course, the spring thunderstorms on top of this. So some of the river systems that we're looking at that may be impacted include the Rock and Illinois rivers, and also some of the smaller tributaries that feed into those, as well as the main stem Mississippi River from about dam 14 or 15 and downstream. And then also local tributaries that feed into the Mississippi from eastern Iowa, southern Wisconsin, and western Illinois. One other factor to consider that can enhance or reduce the severity of flooding each spring is frost depth. And we'll show that here on the next slide. And how frost depth is how deep the frost penetrates into the ground. This year, the frost has not gone very deep thanks to the mild conditions that we had been seeing in the winter up through the middle and latter part of January. As you can see in this graphic, the red, orange, and yellow icons show areas with very shallow frost depth, depth of a foot or less. And that's quite an extensive area, reaching all the way up into southern and even central Minnesota and up into central Wisconsin. The only areas with deeper frost that we see are over North Dakota and across northern Minnesota, and the depth there is down to around 2 feet or maybe more. So frozen ground acts as a barrier, kind of like concrete, so that when the snow melts, it can't get through there and soak into the ground, and it has to run off directly into creeks and rivers. That's why we're so concerned about how deep the frost goes. But with less frost overall in the ground does have a propensity to thaw a little faster, and that's going to allow more of the meltwater to soak in. So all in all, it looks like frost is not going to add too much to our frost risk this spring overall. On the next slide, we're going to talk about one more thing, ice jams. The relatively mild winter that we had been having up through January kept rivers open and ice-free for a longer period of time than normal across our area. Many of the rivers that typically ice over, even in December, were still running free in January with minimal ice cover. We still have some pretty good cold going on right now the last few weeks, and also, as Katie mentioned, for another week or two. So that's causing some more ice production at this time, and that's led to a little bit of a problem with freeze-up jamming in some spots. The most notable ice jams so far this year has been along the St. Clair River, this picture here. It runs along the international border from Detroit northward. And we also have some flooding occurring from freeze-up jamming in the Wisconsin River near Portage, Wisconsin. As long as we continue with this cold weather pattern, we're going to have a risk for some more freeze-up jams to form in other places. So we're going to have to watch out for that for another week or two. But then once the warmer spring weather arrives and the snow melt begins, we turn our attention to break-up jamming, where the ice breaks up, starts to move downstream, and then it can get stuck on bridges, sharp bends in the river, or maybe some other kind of obstruction. Overall, I do think that the risk for ice jamming is lower than a typical winter. We have had less cold overall to create freeze-up jams, so they've been spotty at best. And I also think that the lack of deep cold for a long period of time has not allowed ice to become really thick in the rivers, and the thicker ice is the stuff that tends to get jammed up on these obstructions. So I would categorize overall the threat as low or perhaps medium risk for ice jamming for the rest of the spring here into the warm-up period. So in summary, we'll put this on the next slide. Overall, I think our risk for flooding in our service area is generally less than what we would see in a typical year. There may be some flooding, but most of it should remain in the minor category. We do have a risk for some ice jamming, as I said, but it's also lower than most years. And I didn't really mention it, but similar to what Jim mentioned for Lake Erie, with high water levels continuing on the Great Lakes, shorelines of Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron will all still be susceptible to flooding and erosion problems, especially during the larger spring storms as strong winds and waves crash into the shoreline. And finally, as usual, spring precipitation and temperature patterns in the coming weeks are going to determine our final snow melt rate and runoff timing. So with that, I will now pass it on to Kevin Lau, the Service Coordination Hydrologist at Missouri Basin River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. So this first slide, flood risk, I guess I should start out with the statement. Flood risk for this spring for the Missouri River Basin is being categorized as below normal flood risk. And this first slide is to help show why we are saying that. The right-hand graphic is the probabilistic 90-day distribution for the Little Sioux River at Lynn Grove, Iowa. And it serves as an example of the departure or the gap between historical and today's conditions. Historical being depicted by the blue line and today's condition being the black. And so what this right-hand graph is trying to show is that conditions on the ground today result in a decrease in the chance to reach flood stage at this location, Lynn Grove, of 31% as compared to normal or historical. Now, on the map on the left, Lynn Grove would show up as a dark blue dot, the colors of the dots depicting the departure from historic for each forecast location in the Missouri Basin. So as can be seen on the left-hand map, locations can be found throughout the Missouri Basin having anywhere from 10 to as much as a 50% reduction in flood risk. Now, mind you, there are a handful of locations, notably the little yellow dots that you see in eastern Nebraska and central Missouri, that have 10 to 30% increase in flood potential. And so this blanket statement that the basin has an overall decrease in flood risk does not hold for each and every one of the forecast locations, some 400 plus across our basin, but it is the general trend. And so that's why we are saying that flood risk for 2021 is reduced for the Missouri Basin. So let's look at some of the reasons for this. And so with the next slide, we'll be looking at, and this slide is courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the NRCS, and it shows the mountainous basin snowpack in percent of average snow water equivalent. And snow water equivalent, as you perhaps know, that's the amount of liquid contained in the snowpack. And so mountain snowpack for the Missouri Basin is about average in the northern Rockies to below or well below average in the southern Rockies. And by this point in the winter, we have normally accumulated about 65% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent. So we still have a little ways to go, and so things could change. Moving to the next slide, the February water supply forecast issued this past week by the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center is graphically summarized on the left-hand panel, and it suggests a below average mountain runoff year, volumetrically speaking, for the mountainous west. And that would tend to be what you'd expect since we have a normal to even below normal snowpack. Significant flooding from mountain snowmelt alone is not expected this year. Moving down to the plains, plain snowpack in the Missouri Basin, while widespread, is generally shallow. Again, this graphic, courtesy of the National Weather Service Office of Water Prediction, depicts snow water equivalent across the basin. Again, the amount of liquid contained in the snowpack. Appreciable plains snowpack is limited to eastern Nebraska and western Iowa, where 1 to 2+ inches of snow water exists today. And now we'll go to talking about river ice, which Jim and Mike have already alluded to. Going into this winter with warmer than normal temperatures, reduced flow on many of the streams in the fall, one would have thought that river ice issues would have been limited within the Missouri Basin this year, but we have had quite a bit of activity thus far. Freeze-up ice jams have occurred at many locations, including the Wind River in Wyoming, the lower Yellowstone in Montana, the Jefferson River in Montana, and that is where this photograph was taken on December 31st. This is the Jefferson River near Three Forks. Other rivers that have experienced freeze-up ice jams include the North Platte, the Platte, and the Niobrara rivers in the state of Nebraska. And those are just some of the examples. So, and some of these freeze-ups have had localized impacts. However, we are not out of the woods yet. The current Arctic blast that is impacting the Missouri Basin, well, the entire central U.S., is expected to last through most of February. and that's raising concerns. It's not just the magnitude of the below freezing temperatures, but the duration of the cold spell, something like 2 weeks. And that's going to result in river ice formation and river ice thickening. Furthermore, the river ice will remain into March, and that could spell trouble, especially in the lower portion of the Missouri Basin, where March can also bring quick warm-ups and rain. Quick warm-ups could make for rapid plains snowmelt where the snow does exist. And the runoff from snowmelt and or rain could lead to river ice breakup and jamming, and that could result in flooding issues. The probabilistic outlooks that we develop and that I'll be discussing in the next few slides do not take into account the added risk of river ice. And so everyone needs to bear in mind that the current cold blast and the resulting buildup of river ice poses an added degree of uncertainty, especially in the Nebraska and Iowa area, that the following graphics do not take into account. So now I'm going to go area by area through the Missouri watershed, highlighting those basins that our long-range outlooks indicate having a better than 50% chance to see flooding. With regard to Nebraska, that you're seeing here, right now, minor flooding is limited in likelihood to Wahoo Creek, shaded here in yellow in east central Nebraska. Moving eastward into Iowa, minor flooding is expected along the Big and Little Sioux rivers, again highlighted in yellow in the northwestern corner of Iowa. Moving southward into Kansas, moderate level flooding is likely along Stranger Creek, highlighted in red here in northeast Kansas, and the Little Osage River, shaded in red in the southeastern section of Kansas. Minor flooding is expected along the Big Blue, the Black Vermilion, and the Mare-de-Seine rivers, all shaded here in yellow. And now moving to our last state, the state of Missouri, a very long list of rivers expected to see flooding again this spring. And this is nothing new. This is all very typical for this time of year for the rivers in the state of Missouri. In fact, some of these rivers have already witnessed 2 bouts of flooding during the latter half of January already. The January flooding reminds us that flooding can and does occur in the lower basin year-round. Finally, I wanted to break out the lower 800 miles of the Missouri River on its own slide. The Missouri River below Kansas City is expected to experience minor flooding this spring. And so in summary, mountain snowpack is near to below average in the mountainous west. We've still got roughly 35% of the accumulating season left, and so things could still change. Flooding due to mountain snowmelt alone is not expected. Plain snowpack is on the light side, with heaviest amounts to be found in eastern Nebraska and Iowa. The latest drought monitor puts 91% of the Missouri Basin in abnormally dry conditions or worse. Soils are cold, and they are getting colder, but they won't freeze in solid because the soil moisture just isn't there. And so we believe frozen ground conditions will not play a factor in exacerbating spring runoff. So overall, the Missouri River Basin has a reduced risk for springtime flooding in 2021. Thunderstorm activity typically drives flooding in the lower basin, and so we are expecting again episodic minor to moderate flooding this spring across eastern Kansas and the state of Missouri. But going into March with river ice, which we will, is not a good thing. And I am concerned with locations in the southern half of the basin that have the potential to see a quick March warm-up and March rains, given that river ice is sure to be present. Thank you. This concludes the flood potential brief for the Missouri Basin, and now I'll hand off the presentation to James down in the Arkansas red.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll start off by stating up front that the outlook calls for a near normal risk of flooding for almost the entire Arkansas Red Basin, except for the upper Arkansas River in central Colorado, which will be below normal. Our first slide will show some snow information for the state of Colorado. and the Arkansas River Basin in Colorado from the NRCS showing the snow water equivalent. As of this morning, it was about 96% of normal, with almost 2 months to continue building snowpack. However, if you recall the drought monitor graphic earlier, this area is experiencing moderate to exceptional drought, and the outlook is calling for the drought to persist. For this reason, and because our long-term hydrologic models indicate it as well, the upper part of the Arkansas River, mainly upstream of Pueblo Lake, has a below normal flood risk. On the next slide, we can see the ABRFC's precipitation estimates with respect to normal since January 1st and for February thus far. An earlier graphic highlighted a portion of southern Kansas and northern Oklahoma that indicated above normal precipitation since December 1st. However, much of that precipitation fell in December, as the left graphic shows the year-to-date percent of normal precipitation. Since January 1st, we have generally seen less than 75% of normal over most of the basin, with a couple of exceptions in the plains of southeast Colorado and also southeast Kansas. February's precipitation shows a much drier image on the right. Much of the basin has seen less than 25% of normal so far this month. On the next slide, we show the status of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation reservoirs in our basin with respect to amount of flood storage used. All of the lakes are in good shape, with only one reservoir in northeastern Oklahoma utilizing slightly more than 10% of its flood storage capacity. Within the Corps' Tulsa district, the Arkansas River system is using about 5% of the total flood storage, and the Red River system is using about 2%. With a relatively dry forecast over the next couple of weeks in our area, we would expect these reservoirs to be able to continue to release some of this excess water without any flooding issues. Our next slide shows the long-range forecast of rivers having a 50% or greater chance of flooding. Although we aren't seeing any widespread areas of above 50% chance of flooding, we do have a few rivers which we are more concerned about in the eastern part of the basin. These include the Neosho River and Bird Creek in northeastern Oklahoma, the Illinois and Poto Rivers in eastern Oklahoma, the Little River in central Oklahoma, and the Foos-Lafave River in central Arkansas. It should be noted that these rivers are the usual ones that have a higher chance of flooding in any given spring, so it is not out of the ordinary. Finally, our summary slide. We do have some rivers where we expect to see some spring flooding, but in general, we are calling for a near normal flood potential across the Arkansas Red Basin. The lone exception is in central Colorado, where we are expecting a below normal risk of flood in the Arkansas River system above Pueblo Lake. And as a reminder, most of the spring flooding that does occur within the Arkansas Red Basin is driven by convective storms, which can occur over any portion of our watershed at any time of year. And with that, I'll pass it on to Jeff at the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center.
All righty, good afternoon. Thank you, James. As far as our area, a little bit different tune than what we've had over the last couple of years. This year's been a lot drier than what we've had back in 2019 and 2020. So we really didn't have any flooding and haven't had any flooding on the main stem of the Mississippi River or the Atchafalaya rivers this year so far. We did get a good swath of 3 to 6 inches of rainfall over the southern parts of Louisiana overnight and this morning. So we are starting to get a little bit more minor flooding, some isolated moderate flooding too over portions of the Amite-Comite River systems and then parts of the Pearl River and Pascagoula systems in the Mississippi area. But overall, though, our areas really don't have quite as much flooding as we typically have for this time of year across our area. We'll switch to the next slide and talk about the lower Mississippi and the Atchafalaya rivers. And right now, so like you said, no flooding has occurred over the lower part of the Ohio and lower part of the Mississippi River. So flows are really just slightly above normal in some places, but we're really looking at pretty significant falls here over the next couple of days and weeks actually, and things are going to come down quite a bit lower. We got a cresting conditions right now around the Natchez, Mississippi area, but that's really quite a few feet below flood stage, so it's really just a wave that moved down the Ohio here a couple of weeks ago that's making its way down on the lower part of the Mississippi now. Long-range models right now still not really indicating any flooding over our area. The rises look like right now would start to occur in the later part of February and through March. And we'll really have to wait and see exactly how much rain we actually get in the upper parts of the valley and stuff, whether it's more snow or whether it's more rainfall, to determine exactly what the extent of or the magnitude of the crest that we're looking at for later on to March. But right now, early indications are that we're not seeing any flooding at this time. So what we're anticipating right now for the potential is for just really minor flooding for this winter and spring on the lower Mississippi and the Atchafalaya rivers. Going to the next slide, we'll talk about Arkansas and the Missouri area. And really, again, we really only have minor flooding right now in the lower part of the White River in Arkansas. No other flooding is occurring at this time. Really, conditions are pretty cool right now. We're really not seeing any sort of precip at all. And any precip that we are getting right now has been more in the frozen variety. So based on what we're seeing with long-range models and stuff, we're still only indicating just minor flooding with maybe some isolated moderate flooding possible across this area, which is very typical for this area for the winter and spring. Switching to the next slide, talking about Tennessee and northern Alabama. Quite a bit drier this year than we've had in the past years. We've had almost record rainfall across this area here over the last couple of years, and it's been a lot drier this year. So we're really only looking at the potential for minor flooding across this area over the next several months. Now, we are looking at some rainfall and potential precipitation events coming over the next couple of weeks, and we could get some minor flooding across this area with some of these rainfall events that occur here over the next couple of weeks. Again, it's just going to be dependent on what the temperatures are going to be, whether we get a little bit cooler and keep it more in the frozen variety instead of liquid variety. But in any event, we're really only indicating minor flooding across this area. Looking at Louisiana and Mississippi. Again, drier conditions over the past few weeks, and the exception is that we got 3 to 6 inches of rainfall that fell over the southern parts of Louisiana. They had pretty dry conditions down there starting out, so probably over the next couple of days or so, we'll probably see soil moisture conditions kind of getting back up to what we typically have for the time of year. In any event, though, we are still looking at minor to isolated moderate flooding for this winter and spring across the area here. And we'll just have to watch. Again, we do have several systems coming in over the next week or two, and that could change a little bit. We could get a little bit more widespread minor flooding, a little bit more widespread moderate flooding if we were to get quite a bit more rainfall than what's being indicated right now. But we still are looking at the potential for minor flooding to isolated moderate flooding for winter and spring. And finally, just to kind of summarize everything, we're really looking at flood risk of being characterized as near normal for the lower Mississippi and Tennessee valleys, the main stem of the Mississippi, the Atchafalaya, and really the rest of the area is really, the indications are really minor flooding with some moderate flooding in some isolated locations, which is very, very typical for our area for the late winter and spring. And just as everyone else has indicated, as you go further south, really the rainfall is really the indicator of what the final outcome of flood risk will be for this winter and spring. And with that, I will turn it back over to Katie.
All right, thank you to all of our presenters for giving such wonderful briefs today. Before I quickly summarize their briefs, I did want to remind participants that you can utilize that question GUI in the GoToWebinar panel if you have any questions for this group. So please don't be shy. We're here to answer your questions. So in summary, near normal to below normal flood risk is expected for much of the greater Mississippi Basin, except for portions of the Ohio River Basin and stretching back to Iowa where the flood risk is above normal. Significant flooding due to mountain snow runoff alone is not likely due to the below normal snowpack, but ice on rivers does remain a concern going into the spring. And finally, as everyone has said, the amount of snow melt and the frequency, intensity, and rainfall will ultimately determine the final outcome of the flood risk for this winter and spring. All right, now we will enter into a question and answer session. So please, like I said, if you have a question, don't be shy, put it into the question box here, and we will direct it to the appropriate River Forecast Center. All right, we saw one comment come in here. Can you make the presentation available in case others in the office have questions? Yes, this presentation is being recorded, and I will send out the recording tomorrow to everybody on the distribution list. So it will be uploaded to the National Water Center's YouTube site, so feel free to share as needed. Okay, we've got one more question, it looks like. Says, I know that this overall situation is welcome news for many of us with stubbornly elevated Mississippi River flows over the last 3 years. But do you notice that with the eventual shift to spring and many areas near north of the Ohio River having snow water equivalent, how does this year compare to other La Niñas like 2008 and 2011? How concerned are we about this year versus other years considering North Central and Missouri Basin forecasts and below normal snow water equivalent there? With this displaced polar vortex, it seems like we are limited to the Ohio Valley, providing a good amount of sweep and runoff, but as we know, this can quickly change. So I'm going to open that to Mike or to Jim in OH, whoever wants to jump in there and tackle that one.
Yeah, this is Jim here at the Ohio River Forecast Center. I'll at least start and then Mike can add on to it. In terms of this La Nina event, it does not look as significant as like the 2011 event. That was a very significant event. It may be a little bit more like a 2007, 2008 event. But again, it's hard to always associate to one direct event because each one of those oceanic events are different from year to year, so we try not to associate, but certainly we are watching that snowpack build and we'll know more, so it's worth staying tuned over the next 2 to 4 weeks as we should get a much better handle on things as we go into early March.
Yeah, and for the North Central River Forecast Center area, this is Mike, by the way, for us, the La Nina so far has shifted most of the storm tracks to the south, hitting that part of Iowa into southern Wisconsin. And so the headwater areas that we deal with across Minnesota have not seen a great amount of snow. So we won't be filling the river way up here and then sending it downstream. It's going to only be contributed to from, Wisconsin and Illinois and such. So there'll be a little bit less volume coming down. So that should, at this point anyway, it looks to limit the amount of volume of water coming down the main stem Mississippi. Of course, as we've all said, we still have a few more weeks here of winter, so that can shift. But at this point, it does look like our risk is going to be lower and kind of focus more to the south, like the lower part of our area, and then of course Jim's area, and then south from there. We do have an update coming out, as the slide says there, on Thursday the 25th, so we'll have more information about how things have changed at that time.
Okay, thank you, Mike and Jim there. I'm not seeing really any other questions come through. As I said previously, I did send copies of the slide out to the distribution list about 15 minutes prior to this presentation, and I will send out the recording of this presentation as well as the invite to the next presentation on February 25th. So Thursday, February 25th will be our next External Partners webinar. Please remember, if you have a question that comes up at a later time, you can always reach out to your local weather forecasting office for further assistance. Thanks everyone and have a great afternoon.